5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Plowgian, thank you for your patience. I know it's been a long afternoon. I'm going to review some of the things. And you started in your testimony, we talked about the BEPS project, or the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting project. That was the genesis of this whole initiative. What was the motivation for that project?
It was concern about the ability of multinationals to shift profits into low-tax jurisdictions, essentially.
And what was the goals that the countries participating set for the project?
The basic idea was to try to develop reforms to the international tax rules to prevent multinationals from being able to shift profits into low-tax jurisdictions.
And as we sit here now more than a decade later and we're talking about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, that often gets confusing. We've got initiatives like UTPR. What's your sense of the commitment to the G20 countries to actually moving forward and addressing the original motivations of the BEPS project and what they're trying to achieve with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2?
Well, the G20 finance ministers earlier this week reiterated their support for the two-pillar solution and in particular the steps the countries are taking to implement Pillar 2.
So is it fair to say that irrespective of what we might do in the United States, countries around the world, developed countries around the world are going to move forward here?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Now, we've also talked about this JCT analysis, and my colleagues have been focusing on one of the scenario numbers, but there are multiple scenarios. What's the key distinction between each of the different scenarios?
The key distinctions between the different scenarios are assumptions about which jurisdictions implement. There are several scenarios in which the U.S. implements Pillar 2. There are several scenarios in which the U.S. does not implement Pillar 2. And then there's this distinction between just the 40 baseline or 40-plus baseline jurisdictions adopting versus every single country in the world adopting.
Okay, and what happens if the rest of the world moves forward, and as you noted, the leading economies are committed to moving forward, and the United States stays on the sidelines? What happens then?
Yes, so if the entire rest of the world adopts Pillar 2, which is the JCT scenario 1, and the U.S. stays on the sidelines, that's the $122 billion number that's been talked a lot about in this hearing. They find that the U.S. would lose $122 billion of revenue.
And the logic behind that is that, in one of the numbers I saw, is an estimate of 75% of the profits that are now located in low-tax jurisdictions like the Canary Islands or Bermuda is going to move to more the G20 economies. The assumption is it would all move to these other economies, not to the United States. Is that correct?
I think that's a large driver of the numbers.
But are there things that the United States could do to make it more attractive for these companies to move their profits from Bermuda back to the United States?
Yes, and in fact, we believe that Pillar 2 does make it more attractive for companies to move their profits back to the United States because it reduces the tax incentive to shift profits out of the U.S. to low-tax jurisdictions. And in fact, OECD and IMF analysis has suggested that reducing the tax rate differentials between the U.S. And offshore centers would significantly increase investment in the U.S.
So if instead of fighting amongst ourselves, we put our heads together and came up with strategic actions as a body to make sure that the United States remains as the innovative place in the world, actually, we wouldn't see a decline in taxes, but by the JCT model, we'd see an increase in revenues to the United States. Is that correct?
That's correct. And certainly Pillar 2 is part of that. In every scenario, if the U.S. adopts Pillar 2, the JCT shows an increase in U.S. tax revenue as compared to the U.S. not adopting.
Okay. And let me finish on one other thing, because I am worried about R&D, and I know we talked about it a little bit. And this wasn't my observation, but I think it's an important observation. 2.5 years ago, we entered into what was a dark moment for the country with the pandemic, for the world, as the world shut down. All of the scientists around the world gathered together or worked together to try to come up with some response, treatments for COVID, vaccines for COVID, and countries tested some. As we sit here 2.5 years later, there are 3 vaccines that are standing, that are desired by the world. All 3 of those were invented here in the United States because we have the greatest innovation, R&D system. We incentivize it, we motivate it, we support it. I do want to make sure as we go forward, and I think it is a fair concern, that whatever we do with Pillar 2, make sure that we protect those incentives, those reasons for companies, the best companies in the world, to base their research and development in the United States, to bring the smartest people and hire the smartest people in the United States, and make sure, God forbid, there's another pandemic, or we have the next revolution, AI, or whatever's coming next, that those innovations are happening in the United States. And with that, I yield back.